Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for joining. My name is Brian O'Hanlon. I'm the Managing Director for Climate Finance at Rocky Mountain Institute, and I am thrilled to invite you to a really dynamic panel that gets us beyond simply talking about measuring the transition to financing the transition. RMI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization dedicated to the transformation of our global energy system for a secure and just and low carbon future. You're going to hear much more from these distinguished panelists, but I'd like to introduce Bob Wigley, who's the chairman for UK Finance, the UK's banking trade body. Bob has spent a career in finance, rising to EMEA, chairman of Merrill Lynch. He's a member of the board at the Bank of England and a chairman of the Green Investment Bank Commission. Bob, thank you so much for being here.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for having me here today. As my colleague said, I represent UK Finance, the trade association for the banking and finance industry in the UK. And a massive thank you to RMI, who've put together this panel, but also have been doing a fantastic piece of work with us, looking at how we can finance a just transition. You'll hear more about that as we go through the panel. I'm really delighted to be here at COP, and I remember when I was chairman of Merrill Lynch in the early 2000s, starting the first sustainable finance strategy team, and then later was asked by George Osborne, the UK Chancellor, to chair the Green Investment Bank Commission, so can claim to have actually created the world's first renewables bank. I do think the UK is playing a leading role in this area, and I do think that COP26 in Glasgow was a big catalyst for our evolution and played really a very important role in putting finance and how we finance the just transition at the heart of the agenda. And since then, the pace of change has picked up a lot. The scale of the issue and the urgency that is required, I think, is now firmly understood by our whole sector. And that means that we're no longer shying away from the difficult conversations of how we're going to pay for the transition in highly emitting sectors, and how are we going to produce a credible path for reduced emissions facilitated by transition plans. And of course, we are pushing the UK government very hard on the sector-specific transition plans, which we think are so important to really putting some meat on the bones of this discussion. And if we are to address this side of the net zero transition, this conversation is going to require our industry to align behind common definitions and concepts. And obviously, jurisdictions around the world are starting to look at how they can do that, including through green taxonomies. But we as an industry can't wait. We haven't got time to wait for the perfect solution to be crafted before engaging in this most necessary of discussions. We therefore need, and are indeed, challenging each other already to think of innovative ways to develop better transition finance and how to embed these ideas across our sector. That is an opportunity, of course, as well as a challenge for our industry. So for that reason, it's been a real pleasure for UK Finance, the organisation I chair, to support the UK Transition Finance Alignment Forum and work closely with RMI to address these issues by creating a space in which we can have open discussions with and between our members and share best practice. So before handing over to the panel, I also want to thank our members, all the members of UK Finance, for the very hard work they've put in. You're going to be hearing today from NatWest, JP Morgan, SMBC, Barclays and HSBC, and I also wanted to thank Societe Generale and Lloyds Banking Group, who are not able to take part in the panel but have played a very important part in our work. So with that, I'm going to introduce our moderator for the panel, James Close, Head of Climate Change at NatWest and indeed Chairman of UK Finance's panel on this subject. He was instrumental in setting up this working group as part of his role as our Chair of UK Finance's Sustainability Committee. So with that, over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Bob. And good afternoon, everybody. And it really is an enormous pleasure to be here. I've been going to COP since COP28 and when I was Director for Climate Change at the World Bank. And the topic of financing the transition has always been central to what we're trying to do. And it was last year in Sharm el-Sheikh that we had a conversation with a number of people to start stimulating the topic of transition finance and how we bring it to life, codify it and standardize it in a way that enables us to implement it and ensure that it's an enabler for the delivery of our transition plans. So it's taken a lot of really great collaboration to get to this point, and I've got a great panel of participants to describe their experiences of transition finance and how we can start to bring this together and make it come to life in everything that we do, so that we deliver the ambition that Mark Carney set out at Glasgow, that every financial transition has climate, every financial decision has climate right at the very heart of it. So on my panel, I've got today Laura Barlow, who's the Group Head of Sustainability at Barclays. I've got Celine Herweger, who is the Group Chief Sustainability Officer at HSBC, and Masayuki Takahashi-san, who's the Group Chief Sustainability Officer of Sumitomo Mitsui Financial Group. And hopefully we'll be joined shortly by Heather Zekel, who's the Global Head of Sustainability at JP Morgan Chase. So I want to open up the conversation really with you, Laura, and start to get your views around the main challenges you see in deploying transition finance and what are the potential opportunities associated with it, and perhaps bring it to life by giving us some examples of what Barclays has done in this area.
Thank you, James, and thank you all. It's been fantastic to be part of this process together. And I think at Barclays, I'm actually going to turn it the other way around, and I'd like to talk a bit about the opportunities first, because we tend to spend a lot of time focused on the challenges, and I'm sure we're going to cover those as well. But it really started for us with understanding the scale of capital needed in the hard-to-abate sectors, and that was by sector, by geography, but importantly, where could we be relevant? So where did we have the skills in sustainable impact banking, in capital markets, in SME banking and in investing to be able to bring capital to those really hard to abate sectors where that capital was needed. So we started with that top-down sector regional alignment view. And then alongside that, and we use that to inform our sector transition strategies, which help to identify where the requirements would be, where the big pools of capital are going to be needed. And alongside that, we've been doing bottom-up assessments through our client transition framework to understand at a client level within those sectors, where are the needs of different types of clients? Where are they on that transition journey? Is it going to be an M&A-led strategy for them? Is it going to be a divestment strategy? Is it going to be an investment in decarbonization technologies? And the issues are very different for different sectors. So if I take agriculture in the UK, we bank around 1 in 4 farmers in the UK. The needs of farmers to move to regenerative agriculture and reduce their emissions are very different from, say, aviation, obviously. And there we are building peer-to-peer learning networks for farmers to help each other learn on their journey, but also setting aside 250 million of finance to help them invest in the equipment and the processes they're going to need to decarbonize their farms. And then right at the startup scale, we are investing in some of the technologies that are actually going to be needed to reduce emissions in the hard-to-abate sectors. So if you have a chance to go to the startup zone, you'll see a number of the companies that we've invested in through our sustainable impact capital that are developing low hydrogen aviation, marine concrete that's biodiversity positive, and other technologies. They're going to be part of how we reduce emissions in the hard-to-abate sectors. So we're not doing it to be a sort of venture capitalist. We're doing it to find the solutions that we can then help bring to our clients. And this year in particular, we've been starting to codify transition finance. So we hope shortly to be publishing a framework which will complement our green and sustainable finance framework that will set out a very preliminary view of what we categorize. We've been fairly conservative, and I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about definitions and the challenges in reaching those. So we've been fairly conservative in our initial view of what we could count as transition finance that will be eligible towards our overall mobilization target. So those are some of the approaches we're taking. The challenge, of course, is standardization and the concern, the risks of being seen to greenwash, but also the concern that actually, as you deploy more capital to hard-to-abate sectors, your emissions may go up in the near term, notwithstanding that we will have targets over time to align our financing and bring emissions down. So, that's something we all need to be really thoughtful about, because that mustn't get in the way of getting the finance where it's needed.
And when you say conservative, Laura, you mean you're applying a high bar for finance to qualify as transition finance?
Yes, and really where you can see dedicated use of proceeds. I think the aligned and aligning categories are really important, but I think it's going to take longer to have a clear view amongst ourselves and the industry as to what is an appropriate or credible transition plan, and therefore when does a company count as credibly transitioning, where you could then say that general corporate purposes financing is transition finance.
Great, thank you. And Celine, how has HSBC reduced the barriers for businesses to access transition finance? And again, could you give us some examples of how you've deployed that?
So I might start actually a bit more high level, if I may. First of all, lovely to be here with everyone. I think a starting point, and because there's a lot of focus on labeling, right? What do you label as green? What do you label as transition, which is transitioning from brown to green, and it's somewhere in the middle. But actually at the highest level, everything we provide needs to be transition finance. And that kind of, Laura, you were kind of getting there in what you were saying, because basically the way we need to work is that across industries, especially in the most carbon intensive industries, we need to be working with our customers on their transition plans, pushing them in terms of ambition on transition plans, in terms of solution, in terms of speed, in terms of technologies, and then finding the financing and investment solutions sometimes to support them with that, right? So I think that's the starting point, is that we do two things at once. Yes, we do have these, each of us have these targets around green transition, sustainable finance that need to qualify. There's a handbook we have, and we can talk a bit about some of the standards and whether they're good enough, especially around the KPI linked ones, because that's a key area for greenwashing. But I think the fundamental is to get right the fact that all the financing, all the corporate level financing we provide through customer relationships ultimately needs to be transition finance, right? And so in terms of doing that, we've all set these things called our financed emissions targets for the hard to abate sectors, right? So they'll be aligned onto for us, the IEA NZE net zero economy 1.5 scenario, and then we have to work towards that in terms of portfolio alignment. We make decisions on our portfolio. I think probably for all of us, they're intensity-based targets for the hard-to-abate sectors, and that's because those are the sectors that require finance in order to change their technology and infrastructure bases to decarbonize, right? So it doesn't make sense setting an absolute 2030 target for those sectors because of the volume of finance. It's 150 trillion across sectors in the next 3 decades, of which 60% needs to go to the emerging world. Then when you think about the hard to abate sectors, you say, okay, where is the heart of lots of those sectors? Where are they geographically? And HSBC especially, a lot of the heart of our hard to abate industries actually sits in conglomerates in Asia, right? And they have quite a different structure. And so we also have to, as we think about those specific targets as well, we also have to think about how we engage with those clients around the time frame. What does credibility look like in different regions? When you think about a hard to abate sector, some of it is about electricity access. So they'll be accessing a grid at a very different place than a German heavy industry client will be accessing the grid. And then there's also the kind of solutions that they need to finance. So we're doing a lot, a core part of our strategy is that engaging with customers on their transition plans, putting in place, detailed evaluations, scoring systems, year by year looking at progress, setting up engagement plans with our relationship managers with those clients, and then feeding that in, biannually looking at the portfolio, looking at transition plan scores, financed emissions of that particular client alongside credit risk, alongside commercial metrics, alongside strategic metrics, and starting to manage that portfolio as a whole. Technologies are critical for hard to abate. I think most of them are very nascent technologies at the moment. So that's why we also have a strong focus on the kind of new economy segment. And that's both entrepreneurs, but also helping established players look at acquisitions, but also invest in the innovation internally. So we do a number of different things, but recently we announced a 1 billion allocation for climate tech, which includes a big focus on hard to abate innovations, and that's focusing on the earliest stage of innovators on the back of our launch of innovation banking, and that's venture debt capital right now that we're providing. But we're also looking at project finance, so we've invested into Breakthrough Energy, Catalyst, and that group, which again is focused on carbon removal tech, sustainable aviation fuels, long duration battery storage and things. So there's a lot of us here, so I'll pass on. But I guess the key point I was trying to say is don't just think about the labeling. Think about the fact that everything we do has to be transition.
Yeah, and I think that point is really central to it. So we're trying to provide an approach that is universal to the whole balance sheet and over time. And obviously it might take a little bit of time to get there. But you were talking a little bit about the new economy segments. And I think as we look at the rate of decarbonisation that we're going to have, you have to kind of really think differently about what the future economy is going to look like. And I think for banks that's quite difficult because we look at creditworthiness through the lens of what we do today, not what we're going to do in the future. So could you say just a little bit more about how you identify some of those new economy segments and then how you apply a different risk appetite to them that enables you to finance them and help them scale up as quickly as they possibly can?
I'll be quick on that because, again, I've got colleagues here on the panel. But, I mean, one of the first things when Noel, our group CEO, brought me in was to build a centre of excellence team of basically pure play transition or technology experts, right? So we brought in kind of global leaders on car removal technologies, on clean hydrogen, and then down the sector verticals, heavy industry verticals, the energy transition verticals. And these are specialists. They're there on demand, almost like an internal kind of think tank or consulting shop that are there to work with both the business teams themselves to help identify and win the opportunities in that space and differentiate in front of clients. But very importantly, James, with the risk teams in terms of how we're looking at credit risk and understanding and helping with the technical due diligence because they're so new. Yeah. But also partly what we're doing is also we're setting out different parameters. So we are kind of doing carve-outs on our balance sheet and saying, actually, we're doing the stress testing around it, but we're saying, look, we do have appetite for higher RWAs for this amount. We're also looking at equity partnerships we can have with some of the asset managers where we invest equity, we get exposure to their ecosystem of new economy clients, and then we offer kind of ancillary banking services to help them grow. So we're trying to support throughout that space, but also definitely take appetite to do more of this. Great,
thank you. And Masayuki-san, earlier this year, SMBC released their transition financing playbook, which details the principles that govern your approach and provides guidance on whether certain activities can be financed. Can you talk us through a little bit about those principles and how you're applying the transition finance playbook in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, if I could step back a little bit. The reason that we did, kind of publish our version of, transition finance is because, firstly, I think in order to kind of promote this, it's not necessary that we wanted to label any transition finance, but we wanted our bankers to understand what sort of deals we think that we should finance versus what sort of deals we won't be able to finance. And therefore, for that to happen, we thought that we needed some sort of guidance for our bankers as well. And as people earlier have been explaining, especially as a bank that has headquarters in Asia, where there's a population that's growing massively, and you still have people that don't have access to energy, not alone renewable. We needed this kind of guidance, and so what we did. I think again we do think that in the short run our finance emissions might go up because we wanted to provide financing to the hard-to-abate sectors, which at this moment are heavily, for instance, dependent on fossil fuels. But we needed some kind of guidance so that we can explain to our stakeholders that actually our finance emissions might go up, but because these are the reasons, namely because we're providing transition finance, our finance emissions might go up. But for us to be able to explain that, we thought that we needed some kind of guidance. So that's how that happened. But at the same time, each region is in a different situation in terms of their decarbonization journey. So we looked at various taxonomies around the world. There's the EU taxonomy, but each government, especially for instance Asia, a lot of governments issue various taxonomies, which is different in each country. So we actually did, with some help from outsiders, look at various countries' taxonomies and incorporated that into our transition finance guideline. And what actually did happen was that because we had this guideline, it was now easier for our bankers to actually talk to our clients and say, well, you need to do this, or we can finance this, but it might be difficult to finance, for instance, this part. Then can you change this part of your strategy? So that kind of conversation, engagement is happening much more smoothly with this kind of guidance. And that I think that was not necessarily what we expected, but I think that was a very good outcome of issuing this guidance. Obviously, we still have challenges. There are transactions. Well, a lot of transactions have, use of proceeds going to one area and other use of proceeds going to other areas. Do we call this transition finance or not? This is a very difficult, we're still facing that challenge. So it's not perfect, obviously. We will improve as we go along, but we had a go at our transition finance guide.
Great. And I think the theme that you've heard from all of the panelists so far is that we don't do this in isolation. We have to do it in consultation and in engagement with our customers. And I think that that dialogue and that sort of set of incentives and a framework that helps the customers understand what it means to align with our ambitions as banks is really central to the approach here. And I just wonder, at SMFC, as you've gone through that and started to use the playbook, has that affected your pricing and the way in which you've incentivized customers to do things differently as a result of, green loan discounts and things like that? Or is it too early to deploy that sort of approach?
Yeah, I think we're still discussing internally on that point. But I think that's one option that we might want to think about, but still not done that yet at this moment.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And Heather, to you next. From your perspective and from JP Morgan's perspective, why is the investment rather than divestment in high emitting sectors so important for your approach to the net zero transition and fulfilling the commitments you've made?
Right. Well, the great thing about being the last speaker on a panel with very impressive sustainability leaders is that you can pull on a lot of the key themes that each of the panelists has mentioned. I mean, I think for starters, we all think about the fact that the window for action is short. But what we need to think about and what we at JP Morgan Chase focus on is the fact that we need to balance the climate imperative with the need to address energy affordability and reliability. And in that broader process of thinking through the transition, one of the themes that Celine mentioned, which I think is spot on, is that you also need to meet clients where they are. And depending on where in the world you're located, things are very different, and that picture looks very different regionally. I have looked at every single analysis and seen that fossil energy is going to continue to be part of our energy mix, and obviously that's going to be decreasing over time. But we also know that we need to find and identify scalable, bankable solutions to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors. And so it's really about working with our clients to help do that, to help, as Celine said, identify, what are we looking for in terms of best practices from our clients? How do we work with our clients to think through that energy transition? What's going to be workable? And then, I think just starting from a place that even as you think about the different industries, everybody's going to be on a very different kind of journey. So whether you're, electric vehicles, whether you're, hydrogen infrastructure or carbon capture and sequestration, the needs of those clients are going to be very, very different as we're thinking through decarbonization. But again, from JP Morgan's perspective, I think we view the business opportunity as equal to the challenge of tackling climate change. And we also view that whether you are a large incumbent energy company or a small scale startup, we're going to need everybody to be part of the solution, and that's what we're focused on.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And in that approach, what's I think interesting, certainly the three of us have made commitments on different forms of financing. We call it different things. I think we call it climate and sustainable finance and funding. I think you've called it transition finance. And when we engage with our shareholders, it's difficult, and NGOs as well, actually. And in fact, the Share Action have done quite a lot of work to try and probe into the precise meaning of some of these things. How are you going to sort of build that codification of transition finance and the way in which you describe it and align it with what you're doing and targets that you might set at some point in the future?
Yeah. So I think we actually just released our climate report for 2023, and embedded in that is very, clear and transparently stated our goals for 2030 and ultimately to 2050. Those certainly align with net zero, and I think from our perspective, we are very focused on trying to be as transparent as possible and help everybody, whether that's a stakeholder, a shareholder, an NGO, help people understand how we're thinking about that transition. We also issued a methane paper, which we did a lot of work to kind of show and think through, like, what does best practice look like from JP Morgan's perspective when it comes to abating methane emissions, and sort of what's good and what's great, and try to help provide, again, that level of transparency, being clear about what those expectations from our clients are, and obviously ramping up ambition over time.
Yeah, and I think that methane example is a brilliant one, isn't it? And it's been really at the forefront of the COP here, identifying that it gives us a window of time to decarbonize because of its global warming potential and the rate at which it exits from the atmosphere. So that's an area where we really need to get as much capital to it as quickly as possible. But you could be disincentivized from doing it because it doesn't fit into the criteria that we set ourselves. So this greater sophistication around transition finance, I think, gives us a way of demonstrating what we're doing and the impact that we're having that aligns with the objectives that we're setting. Exactly. So I just want to thank you all very much. It was really, really great to hear of the progress that you're making, the approaches that you're taking. But a common question, I'll start with you, Heather, first, so that Laura has the advantage of building on everybody else's comments. But what do you think is required for financial institutions to build credibility around transition finance? What are you looking for that's going to facilitate this? Well,
it might have something to do with my prior life where I'm a recovering regulator, but I think the short answer is policy. The financial services sector and sort of the scope of what banks can do to support the transition is going to be limited as long as there are significant barriers for the real economy transition. And so, I think there are policies out there that are certainly a step in the right direction, whether that's the EU green policy or the US Inflation Reduction Act. But, we need additional, we are going to do our part, but we are also not going to solve that challenge alone. So the more we are leaning in, talking about the need for long-term policies, long-term prices on carbon, that's going to continue to be an important part of what we believe, and I think ultimately an important part of what's needed for us to get to those greater and deeper decarbonization targets.
Yeah, and I think there's a really nice virtuous circle here, isn't there, which you show the policymaker that the finance is available. That gives them confidence then to put the policies in place, and also really locks them into long-term policies as the finance starts to flow alongside it. So we can be both a policy taker, but also a policy shaper in the way in which we approach it.
Yeah.
So Masayuki-san, same question to you. What do you think's needed here to really make this transition finance framework come to life?
Yeah, so I kind of agree with the point about policy. Again, we did create our transition finance guideline, Playbook. But there are countries that don't have a kind of roadmap or pathways towards net zero. especially when we talk about sectoral pathways. There are, industries where governments have a detailed pathway, but there are sectors that don't, that doesn't exist. So we are struggling with that point, but if we have some kind of guidelines from policy, it will make our lives much easier and provide us confidence to provide transition finance if we have that guidance. And so that's one point. Secondly, I think public blended finance is another point that I think we should hopefully we could share more risk with the public sector as well.
Yeah, great, thank you. And just on the policy side, talk a little bit about what's coming out of COP28 at the sort of global policy and how that might relate to the national policy and how that dynamic might work.
Yeah, I think if the message comes out that it's important for each government to kind of have these guidelines, but personally, I don't think it's a good idea to have a single global kind of policy because, again, there's differences in regions and the journey is completely different in each country. So, but as a global message, if, for instance, COP28 can kind of push each government to have these kind of roadmaps or taxonomies, I think that will be a great outcome.
Yeah. And Celine, what are you looking for?
So I'll start with the regulators, and I'll go back to your question on how to build trust around what we're actually doing in the transition finance. I think from the regulator perspective, I think the taxonomy, like actually having a clear, ideally they all come together and it's not a big patchwork quilt and we have to report differently on transition finance in each taxonomy, which is potentially where it's going. But, we all want to have a common way of reporting this. So it's not that, Barclays reports differently from HSBC, from JP Morgan. We ideally want a single way, the same way we have a single way to measure greenhouse gas emissions under the greenhouse gas protocol, right? Yeah. So, so that really is needed, and I think there's some areas in particular that are grey that are probably most at risk from greenwashing. So, for example, the sustainability-linked bonds, sustainability-linked loans. We need kind of a bit stronger set of guidelines around that. When you're coming up with KPIs to define something as transition in a higher emitting sector, whether it's energy or heavy industry, we need the right level of KPIs that the community thinks is acceptable, right? And again, having a standard guidance rather than each of us making our own decision on that would be very, very helpful. But again, then you have to bring in just transition. So what's an acceptable, decarbonization profile in an emerging economy versus an advanced economy? It might not necessarily be the same pace, the same starting point. For sure, it won't be. So I think that's really important. On the regulatory side, again, for hard-to-abate sectors, again, we're not going to get there without huge commercialization of very, very nascent technologies that have high capex costs that are going to take many, many years to develop and commercialize, that at the moment have a big green premium, however you want to call it. And are not, the economics in many cases are buying like SAFs, it's 4x or 2x, conventional fuels. So I think from that particular point, and in terms of financial regulators, at the moment, those projects also have long tenors, right? They're long time frame. If we do project finance, they're high risk-weighted assets. Even if we do it at the corporate level, there's no recognition, even with the use of proceeds instrument that. So ideally, right, we have a short window of time to accelerate finance in the transition. At the moment, it's very hard for banks to do this stuff on our balance sheet, whether it's project finance, whether it's corporate, but going to fund these types of investments. It comes with a high capital allocation, and it's difficult for us to do at scale. And that shouldn't be the case, right, when we need to get scale in these areas. So I think those are the two from the regulatory side, in addition to actual national policies and regulations, new industrial, green industrial policy on steroids, like we're seeing through the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, that is the kind of stuff, production tax credits, subsidies, that's revolutionary in terms of scaling the technologies we need for these industries. And then I think just in terms of building trust on our side, that comes, one will be having a taxonomy, but I think more importantly is, again, decarbonizing the actual whole portfolio of clients. And we will show that now by year-to-year progress on financed emissions. We need to demonstrate that by then how we're embedding that into our decision-making, into You know, the fact that we now have financed emissions as a new metric we look at when a new transaction comes on the table from any client, right? The fact that it's embedded into portfolio management and optimization year to year. So all of those things, and then year by year showing how we're doing on our glide path. And just one final thing is, it's not going to help the world if in 2028, 2029, we start exiting a whole load of clients because the easiest way, let's say, in any given sector, and this one's not hard to abate, but power generation is a perfect example, power and utilities. The easiest way, and a global bank like ours, big portfolio, a lot of clients in the emerging economies, including state-owned enterprises, the easiest way to get to our minus 77% carbon intensity reduction target is to move our portfolio from east to west. That's not going to get us in the real world. And that's the worst thing that will get us to net zero, right? So we really need to think about the unintended consequences of financed emissions, but try and come up with a system that helps us. We're not doing portfolio optimization to get away from the clients that need the most finance to change their infrastructure base over the years ahead.
Yeah, and I think that it ties back to blended finance and the need for that. And I was rather taken with Andrew Steer's description of a deal team for the world. And you start to think about what kind of capital each of the players can bring to the party and use the power of structuring to enable us to get the financing away as cost effectively as possible to accelerate the transition as much as we can. But Laura, final word to you on this.
Well, that's a hard group of things to build on. Sometimes there are disadvantages of being at the end, but I would certainly echo that. Sectoral pathways, policies that support them and are appropriate at a regional level, targeted intervention or support in building the technologies that are needed for hard to abate sector. The UK had a fantastic track record in offshore wind with contracts for difference. There isn't an unlimited amount of government support available, but really targeting it at where those can then bring down the unit cost of these technologies much, much more rapidly than will happen if you rely on the demand signals in the short term. And then those can be deployed globally as the cost comes down. So I do think that's a really important intervention. And then, for us as to, maintain the confidence of all our stakeholders, I do think it's that common definitions, common taxonomies, and I think that, the disclosure requirements we're all increasingly subject to will help in providing that transparency to our stakeholders, because we all know it's not going to be a linear journey, but we need to be able to give the confidence that we are working with and through our clients to support them in abating their own emissions and transitioning their businesses.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you all very much. Thank you to the panel. Superb interventions and comments there, I think, and really thoughtful around the need for transition finance, the way transition finance works with our customers and the way it shifts the dialogue with them, but also the link back to policy and the virtuous circle that we can create through policy here. I think this is just a fantastic example of pre-competitive collaboration. And, a huge thanks to all your team members who've been involved in this forum. It's been a real privilege to chair it, because we've had a breadth of views, but a fantastic dialogue. And that's been wonderfully facilitated by RMI, who brought some extraordinary expertise to this, but also a really lovely style that has enabled us to break down barriers, both intellectual and practical, in a way that I think has created a tremendous repository of information, which I'll talk about in a moment. And of course, also many thanks to UK Finance, who've given us the space to do this, and also brought Ian and Agat, who both have been wonderful parts of the Secretariat to drive much of what we've done. So there will be some more materials coming from RMI. The RMI is a brilliant resource for this. Their website has got some fantastic material and a great blog, and I think there's a resource hub coming next year, and I think there may well be an email address somewhere there if you want to get in touch. But I think the final word goes to John Craze, who's the CEO of RMI, and many thanks to you, and thank you all of you in the audience for engaging in this discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. Thank you to all of our panelists here. Thanks, Bill, for opening us up. Fantastic. I think what I took away from really a brilliant discussion here was all finance is transition finance, right? When we think about it from venture to project-based to corporate to infrastructure. All of this needs to be part of our packages here. When we think about globalization, we can't allow for leakage, and we need to move through the heavy transition or the hard-to-abate sectors. We may invest in things like oil and gas. Our emissions may go up in the near term in our portfolios, and we need to have the ability to measure that. Kind of when I think about how this needs to happen, it's all with communities, right? It's with the community of banks that we have here. It's with the community of NGOs that we have to support that transition. It's with the community of governments that we need to help put in place the regulation. We need to codify the language, set the targets, create transparent tracking and reporting, the KPIs, in essence, the sectoral pathways that we all can sign up to and follow in order to get through to that point where we have a deal team for the world, right? That is working and moving and helping us reposition all of our assets for sustainability. And that is something that is of utmost importance to us at this critical moment. I will say it's difficult. We heard it's difficult, but it's also soluble, right? And for all of us, we should leave with a recognition of something that we call applied hope, right, at RMI, which is that it's not enough for us all just to be passively hopeful. We need to will into existence that world that we so desperately want and need. And in the process, we actually make a world worth being hopeful for in the first place. And this effort kind of showcases how exactly finance can come to the table and unlock the trillions that are required to deliver that world. Thanks so much for joining us here today.